All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for History Happy Hour, A Gentleman in the Shadows. My name is Bethany Rockbeck, and I am the Director of Education and Engagement at the Indiana Historical Society. I'll be manning the chat and making sure your questions get to our speakers tonight. It's so great to see so many of you here, and I hope that you are enjoying a lovely beverage of your choice. This happy hour is brought to you with support from One America Financial Partners, a national provider in the insurance and financial services marketplace. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We do this by collecting millions upon millions of paper-based materials, such as books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, maps. The list is endless. And then we find interesting, exciting, and intriguing ways to share those stories, whether that be through publications, exhibits, or events like the one you are with tonight. It is in these pieces that they tell the diverse, unconventional, even saucy stories of Indiana, and we're excited to bring you one of those stories tonight. But before I introduce the incomparable Ray Boomhauer, who will serve as our moderator, I have just a few logistics. For this event, Doug and Ray will converse for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you have a question, we'll get to that at the end of the program, but please make sure you are using that question and answer box to drop your question in. We'll keep an eye on them and then pepper them in as we get to the second half of the program. And although you're all going to be muted tonight, we do want to hear your thoughts. Feel free to add your comments into that chat box as you go. Just make sure that it is sent to the option that says panelists and everyone, because we all want to hear what you have to say. Keep an eye out there as well, because we'll drop in links and URLs to relevant content. But don't worry if you miss one. We'll get them delivered to you tomorrow in a follow-up email. I also want you to be aware that this program is being recorded. You can catch the replay on our website, www.indianahistory.org, in the coming weeks. And if you enjoy this program, I hope you consider coming back for more. Next week on July 23rd, we are going to be continuing our History Happy Hour series, looking at the history of donuts. But keep an eye out for even more on Asian activism, the Equal Rights Amendment, and even more underwear history. You can sign up for all of those programs and more at indianahistory.org. And so now, without further ado, I want to introduce you to Ray Boomhauer, the senior editor of the IHS Press at the Indiana Historical Society, and Doug Wissing, who is an award-winning journalist and author of numerous books, including Hopeless but Optimistic, Journeying Through America's Endless War in Afghanistan, Funding the Enemy, and Pioneer in Tibet. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Foreign Policy, Politico, Traces of Indiana Midwestern History, BBC, and CNN.com, among other publications, as if that list is not impressive enough, Doug. And so Ray and Doug, thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Bethany. Tonight we're going to be talking about Doug's newest book, Gentleman in the Shadows, Benjamin C. Evans Jr. and the Central Intelligence Agency, which was recently published by the Indiana Historical Society Press. And I had the honor of working with Doug as his editor on the book. But before we delve into the fascinating life of Benjamin Evans Jr., I wanted to ask you a few questions, Doug, about your own career as an author. And you've written several books touching on a lot of different subjects, from regional history to such far-flung locales as Tibet and Afghanistan. But going back, what was it that inspired you to become a writer?
Well, I grew up a few blocks from the Vincennes, Indiana Public Library. It was an old Carnegie brick library. And at a very early age, I discovered it to be this portal into a way to see far-flung places. You know, reading just opened up these different worlds and other people's ways of thinking and other ways of being in the world. And it was also the golden age of newspapers. From being a young boy, I read 3 newspapers a day, sometimes 4 a day. And it was the era when the Louisville Courier-Journal was just a remarkable newspaper that was a very progressive force in educating their readers about some of the great movements of the era, the civil rights movement, the war on poverty, particularly as it applied to Eastern Kentucky. And I could certainly see the parallels to Southern Indiana. So I could see that words mattered. I could see that words could change things. And omnivorous reading made me a very curious kid in many ways, as my teachers could attest. But as we know, reading makes writers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I found that to be true with everyone. Working on a book like this takes a long time. What is it about a story that attracts you that you want to spend your time on it? Is there one attribute that you look for when you're going to be spending your time on a book project?
I think it's the opportunity to learn something new. The way I research has to do with deep dives into the literature of a subject, but that's combined with, most often, with on-the-ground research in whatever is the area that I'm working with. I had been around CIA people. I have written a lot about the war in Afghanistan. I've been out there embedded in 3 times, and they were a little intriguing. I mean, they were shadowy people, to use the title, and the soldiers would call them, when they were on a mission, they would call them OMG, which is that correct? Let's see, other government agencies, OGA, that was it, OGA. And I always thought, what is that? And then I learned, oh, that's code for CIA. So I got a little bit intrigued. But it's that combination of on the ground stuff and the ability to learn something new. Whether I'm going to be going to the Himalayas or to Afghanistan or the Caucasus or the Pampas or inner city Indianapolis, it's the opportunity to kind of go somewhere and combine that with academic research to come to a new understanding. Does a project give me the opportunity to venture out and come back with new understanding?
Now, you've written in a variety of genres. You've written regional history. You've written books for the Indiana Historical Society Press. You've written for Traces Magazine for national publications. You've written nonfiction essays, biography. Is there one genre in particular that you prefer writing, or are you more of a generalist?
To me, it's kind of all storytelling. I grew up around storytellers, particularly my maternal grandfather, Clarence Stout Sr., who was a vaudevillian impresario. He was a composer in the Tin Pan Alley days. He was a raconteur of a very high level. And I think through him, I understood the long history of Indiana. He was the patriarch of my mother's Indiana French family. And so I understood that long history of Indiana, as well as our connections to very distant places. And it kind of ignited an interest in that aspect of storytelling. So when I'm doing research, I'm looking for the storyline. I'm looking for the characters and their defining characteristics. I'm looking for the moments of crisis that help shape people and shape events. And I try to not have too many preconceived notions when I start on a project. When I was in Afghanistan, the first time I was embedded with a team of Indiana National Guard soldiers that were posted to a base called Forward Operating Base Salerno, FOB Salerno, which was in Host Province, which is essentially a Taliban-controlled area of eastern Afghanistan, right on the border of the Pakistan tribal regions that are essentially anarchic. And I was in this place trying to understand these two very different cultures. the US military and the Pashtun tribesmen that were in conflict in this area. Fob Salerno was under attack so often it had a nickname of being Rocket City. You could go to the PXs and get baseball caps embroidered with Rocket City. And one day I was taking, obviously, I was asking, we'd go out on missions and what the security soldiers would call Indian country, which was Taliban controlled areas. And I was asking a lot of questions. I was taking a lot of notes. And one day I was walking across the base with the commander of the team, Colonel Brian Coups, who is now a retired brigadier general. Brian was one of the best leaders I've ever encountered, was one of the brightest men I've ever encountered. And he turned to me and he said, "So what are you going to be writing? What, you know, what's your take on all this?" And I blurted out, "I don't know. I'm just like asking a lot of questions and a narrative will emerge." And that's kind of ultimately the way I think about that. And I think Gentleman in the Shadows was somewhat the same process. We had a very general idea, but at the time I started that book, I did not understand what a powerful figure Ben Evans was and how he fit into all of these incredibly momentous events in American history. So it's a process of discovery.
Let's turn to Benjamin Evans and his life and times. And Bethany, let's look at the photo of Ben in Crawfordsville celebrating Christmas with his brother, Dan. What role did Crawfordsville play in shaping the young Benjamin Evans, Doug?
Well, he was born in 1924, so his boyhood was really during the Great Depression. He grew up in a prosperous Hoosier family. You can get a little bit of a sense of that if you think that this is 1935. The family was still doing fine. And through the family archives and diaries and some remarkable documents that have been left from one of the family retainers, you could get a sense that this was a very prosperous, a very conservative family that were deeply imbued with kind of old school Hoosier values. And that really, you could see the imprint on young Ben Evans. And he was a model Boy Scout, he was an Eagle Scout, he was a student leader. And through that, there's this concept of servant leadership. And I think that was another important element of his overall character and personality. And when he was, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
When he was still a boy, a young boy, he went off to Culver Military Academy that had a summer camp program. And that's a picture of him a little later. And so he started at a young age up in the Culver Military Academy that introduced him to military culture and also introduced him to kind of higher level social skills, so that not only was there the military side of it, but at Culver, you learned how to dance well. You learned how to interact with the wealthy people who lived around Lake Maxinkuckee. You had these very cadenced ways and proper ways of being, and that was part of the training that he learned at Culver. And he rose to be the captain of the Black Horse Troop, which is, of course, a very famous troop and a great honor for him to be the captain. So he was, even at a young age in high school, in this particular photo, he's showing leadership skills and he's showing how he's absorbed these kinds of things, both being a facile social person, but also having this sense of rigor and discipline.
Was there one person, either in his days growing up in Crawfordsville or at Culver, or eventually when he went to West Point, that played a key role in his development and in development of his character and development of who he was as a person?
Well, I think there were two people that, from what I can see, had a major impact on his life. The first one was his grandfather, who was also a staunch Methodist and was a farm financier. And his, that had a big, that man, Frank Evans, had a big impact on Ben. They were really close. And Frank was a bon vivant. He was a dapper dresser. They had the only chauffeur in Crawfordsville. And he developed a 60-acre, essentially country estate along Sugar Creek that is adjacent to the country club for those in Crawfordsville who know the area. And he engaged a society landscape architect named Jens Jensen, who had done a lot of important work up in the Chicago area and elsewhere, and developed a big plan that Frank Evans executed. Young Ben Evans spent a lot of time out there with his grandparents, and they had horses. Frank Evans was a big Audubon Society person, so they had all kinds of birds. The birds would go off to, they would take the winter and go down to Florida, and sometimes the birds would go with them, or they would pack up the peacocks and the caracous and all the various varieties and send them with them. Sometimes they would go to one of the Chicago zoos. It was a posh life where Ben kind of learned that stuff. And also he learned his equestrian skills from his grandfather that then led him into his position with the Black Horse Troop.
Of course, Evans.
Yeah. The second, I think, had a major impact on him was his father, who was a man that became his father-in-law, General Eugene Harrison. And Ben, after he graduated from West Point, we're getting a little ahead of the story. After he went to West Point, maybe if we switch to that next picture, we can see Ben at West Point. So his experience in Crawfordsville led to Culver, led to West Point. And he graduated in the year right after the war ended. And so his first posting was to occupy Japan. And he was involved with what's called psychological warfare, Psy-War, trying to change the culture of Japan. That was this great American experiment to try to turn what was a feudal society into a democratic society. Part of that was changing the educational system totally and completely. Ben's team was part of that. And he had been involved with a major earthquake in the town where he was posted, where enormous responsibility was thrust on a man in his early 20s. And he handled it extremely well and came to the attention of General Eugene Harrison, who was an important figure in World War II, had been a major figure in the US Army intelligence enterprises, and then had been given responsibility for a major swath of part of Japan around Kyoto. He needed an aide de camp. His family had come over with him. He had married, General Harrison had married late in life. He had been a very eligible bachelor in Washington, D.C., and he had married a woman named King, who was an heiress, essentially, who had married another old money person in Washington. That gentleman was also, whose name was King, was also in the intelligence service. He was killed in Normandy. She was a widow, and it was not uncommon for officers to marry the widows of other officers, and that's what happened. So suddenly, General Eugene Harrison is out in Kyoto. He has a new family. She had 3 children, and he needed an aide de camp. He needed, and aides de camp are really completely joined at the hip with military, generals' families. They have enormous responsibilities to manage the household, help with the children, be incredibly discreet because they're sitting in on all the major meetings that the general is having. So they have to be pretty savvy people. And Ben Evans had proved that he had that potential. The general chose him as his aide de camp, and suddenly this young lieutenant was thrust into a position of incredible access to power, and handled it very well, to the point where he became known in the general's family, including his wife, the former Mrs. King, as the Catch. And initially, they were going to bring out one of her nieces before he was swept up by somebody else. But the niece had other romantic entanglements back in Connecticut, as I recall. And so that fell apart. But what was sort of unbeknownst to him, the general's 16-year-old stepdaughter, Jan King, was totally smitten with the young lieutenant, who was substantially older than they were, not knowing that he was also really taken with her. But it was the 40s. It was a very, very, very chaste kind of thing. And so after they left Japan, the general returned back to Washington, and he had identified Ben Evans as a real comer, and so arranged for him to be posted to Washington, really to give him that experience. General Harrison had served to an aide to Stinson during the war, so he understood how being placed in Washington had an incredible effect on a military career, and he wanted that for Ben Evans. Well, his stepdaughter also happened to be in Washington, and they got together.
One thing leads to another. Of course, they get married, and Ben also transitions from a life in the military to life in a new organization, a clandestine service, the Central Intelligence Agency. What kind of a stress did it place on his family with him being in such an organization as the CIA? How important was his marriage to Jan in that? And what kind of a role did she play in helping him deal with the stresses of being in such an organization?
Well, you have to, remember that Jan's father had been in the intelligence services. Her stepfather had been a really important, her stepfather had been on the board that had essentially set up the CIA. And we have to remember that there's always been a strong connection between America's upper class and the intelligence services, going back to the OSS. That was, of course, the clandestine organization during World War I, the intelligence organization during World War I. So tight a connection that it was said, the connections between the upper class, between the Ivy League, between the corporate worlds, that people would laugh and say the OSS stood for oh so social. And Jan King came from old Washington money. She was what was termed a cave dweller, which is the term for kind of the upper crust of Washington that always stayed in place. That was the liaison between the government officials that would come and go and the old money that was in Washington. And there was a lot of mutually beneficial things that happened between those two groups. So her stepfather, General Eugene Harrison, was on the commission that organized the CIA following the demise of the OSS. And by this time it's the 50s, the Korean War has gone on, and they decide that their son-in-law needs to be in this new organization, the CIA. So they had a dinner party, as is the case. And the people who attended the dinner party were essentially the people who were running the CIA. And that's how Ben came to be in the CIA. So Jan, his wife, and his family for that matter, they had been in the culture of the intelligence services for a long time. And when I first started on this project, I couldn't quite understand how would it be when Dad came home from work and couldn't say how his day went. And I spent a lot of time kind of chasing around that question, trying to get at the core of how did that work? How did that feel? And the things that I learned, Jan Evans would say to me, I was a good CIA wife. I never asked questions. And she said, but I was also a very curious person. And when I would kind of forget myself and ask a question of Ben, Ben would say, Jan, is that on a need to know basis? And she was, while she was part of that culture, she learned. And it's also part of the Washington culture. There's lots and lots and lots of people in Washington that can't talk about their jobs. They can't share what goes on with their families. And there was another aspect of it. I mean, the kind of downside to it is there was an emotional distance that sort of naturally has to happen where you're living these bifurcated lives. One of the DCIs, the Director of Central Intelligence, the individual that Ben worked with, he worked with the directors specifically on the 7th floor of the CIA, was a man named Alan Dulles. And his biographer of Alan Dulles had these great descriptions of him being this kind of amiable presence in the family, amiable but distant. And I read, I think maybe it was a book by his daughter, or maybe it was a reference to interviews with the daughter. And the biographer of the head of the CIA said there was sort of an emotional anesthesia in the house. And I thought that was such a great description of this kind of loving relationships, but always needing to stay distant, and the kind of almost the bubble that surrounds those people.
Now, Evans played a key role in a lot of momentous events in our history, from the Bay of Pigs to Watergate to the unmasking of some of the CIA secrets through the Church Committee hearings. Was there ever an incident or something that happened during his service with the CIA that shook his faith in what he was doing, or was he always a kind of a true believer?
Well, Ben Evans was a CIA official for 23 years, from 1957 until he retired in 81. He was a clandestine CIA agent in revolutionary era Cuba, 1959, 1960. He was running a string of covert anti-Castro agents. He was the lead person and essentially ran one of the CIA's largest front organizations, a proprietary, as it's known, the Asia Foundation, that ran gargantuan organizations all through Asia. And it was a CIA front organization. He was, after kind of the Watergate and Family Jewels things, he was kicked upstairs to the 7th floor, where he became the CIA's executive secretary, which is a very powerful position. He was there from 1968 until he retired in 81. He sat in on every top executive meeting. He wrote up the minutes. He did the action plans. He followed through to make sure with all the department heads that whatever those world-shaping events that were formulated in the executive meeting moved forward and stayed on task and maintained progress. So the CIA officers described Ben Evans as the traffic cop of the CIA. So he was part and parcel of that system. He was socially adept. He was unfailingly discreet, and he was facile in the ways of power. He was a consummate intelligence officer. But even for a guy like Ben Evans, everyone has a breaking point. And according to family lore, sometime in the 60s, he had a breakdown. He had an emotional breakdown. The story was he vomited at his desk. He had to go home. He was given a month's leave of absence. He had to go visit with a CIA-approved psychiatrist. And the trigger point that is told, which I will doubt there'll ever be documentation on this, was that he was asked to arrange the assassination of someone he knew. And he had classmates in West Point. This is completely conjectural. He had classmates in West Point that were children of, for instance, the Somoza family, who were the dictators of Nicaragua, and later became the dictator of Nicaragua. And that family was involved with the Bay of Pigs, was involved with a lot of U.S. Clandestine operations. And I was told by a CIA psychiatrist, a longtime CIA psychiatrist, who actually was the head of it for many years, and was a family friend of the Evans. And we didn't speak about Ben at all, but he did say emotional breakdowns are not uncommon, that people are put in these incredible moral quandaries where they're asked to violate the basic rules of our society. So you can imagine a duty and honor bound person like Ben Evans, who was an Eagle Scout, who had absorbed all of those strictures and emotional tethers on a day-to-day basis. He had to violate those things. That's what they did. And there was another Hoosier who was a top CIA guy named Walter Bedell Smith, Beadle as he was known. And he was also a director of Central Intelligence. And he had a line where he said, well, to run this agency, you have to leave your morals at the door. But you better remember where you left them when you leave. And so there's just that constant challenge, that constant pull between these two different parts of somebody who's duty bound and somebody who has to do a very ugly job in a peculiar service, as it's known.
Now, this was a difficult project from the beginning. There was the hope that you might have access to Evans's CIA records. That did not happen. So just how hard was it to write about an individual whose life involved so many secrets?
It was a really hard research project. I had to spend a lot of time with, there's some various caches of declassified material, some at George Washington University, some in other locales. And try as I might with filtering, you still end up with just thousands and thousands of documents, most of which didn't apply to Ben Evans at all. But it was a needle in a haystack process, and kind of methodically going through them, sorting out what did apply, and then trying to piece this story together from little bits and pieces and shards. I kept saying writing this story was like piecing together a jigsaw puzzle that had been through a shredder. And it was, one thing that was very helpful was Ben Evans' widow, Jan Evans Hauser, is still alive. She's in her 80s, is still as vibrant a personality as she clearly was when she met Ben, had still a remarkable memory, and loves to talk about her life in Washington as a cave dweller, as a CIA wife, as a member of the America's aristocracy. And Jan comes from old brewing company money. And one of the aspects of brewing that I learned from writing a book about Indiana brewing for the Indiana Historical Society is brewers end up with a lot of real estate because they are always buying property to put saloons up, to then put their saloon keepers in to sell their beer. That was kind of part of the thing. So Jan Evans' family was the second largest property owner in the District of Columbia, second only to the federal government. So Jan still, to this day, is running the family businesses. And she kept great family archives. When I started on the project, it was unclear about whether the family had any archives, whether it was whether I would have any access to the family archives. And then when we couldn't get access to the CIA documents, it became like one way to do it. And I went out to Washington to visit with Jan. And Jan is used to being the big personality in the room and used to kind of telling people what's going to happen and and I needed for her to get into a process where she could tell me the things in a way that I could understand them sequentially, because otherwise it was like drinking from a fire hose. Yeah, and so I didn't know if that could happen, and it did. She understood, and pretty quickly, like, we had to go through this in a sequential manner. And at some point during that first visit, she said, "Yeah, I have some archives." And she brings down shopping carts full of family archives. And I went, this might work. So it was the combination of the CIA documents that I could unearth, and then just mountains of books in the Cold War era, and chasing down those tiny little, a footnote here would lead you to a footnote in another book, which would lead you to a document, so there was just an enormous amount of really basic, hardcore primary research. And through that, we were able to piece together Ben Evans, both his life and his work, even though it was deep in the shadows. I think we were able to illuminate a lot. It was a start for somebody who was the most powerful person you've never heard of. He always operated behind the scenes.
Someone's asked a question in the Q&A that I'll go to here because it ties in with your conversations with Jan. I assume that she knew that what she could and couldn't say when she was talking to you about Ben's life in the CIA. Did you find that to be true?
I think the truth is she didn't know much.
Oh.
So she learned from the book about her husband. And she learned what he was doing. She knew there's a good friend of the family, a man named Oscar Echeverria, who was a Cuban man that was one of the counter-revolutionaries. He was one of Ben's agents. And Oscar is still alive, had become a powerful banker, Latin American banker. And Oscar knew more than Jan did. Ben went off and did his stuff. So to a certain extent, she was learning. She knew that he was the liaison and actually the CIA manager for the Asia Foundation, because the man who ran that organization became a family friend. And she knew that, but there was stuff she didn't know. There was like hearsay, at some point after the CIA was unmasked as being behind the Asia Foundation, they had to sever ties, and they wanted to keep the Asia Foundation going. So the CIA was basically providing most of the money for the Asia Foundation, 8-10 million a year, somewhere in that range. And when they had to snip the cord, they needed to give the Asia Foundation some money to tide them over until they could arrange other funding. And the story is that the Asia Foundation got 8 million, got 20 million, got some money. And Jan said, yeah, Ben took that out there in a suitcase. And I said, well, Jan, that'd be an incredibly heavy suitcase. I mean, like, I couldn't figure it out. And she goes, well, I mean, that was the story. And the Asia Foundation friend confirmed that. And Ben, Ben never talked about it, but he got on a plane, he went to San Francisco. And so a long time later, a year later, I'm dragging myself through all these documents. I found a bunch of stuff about the Asia Foundation CIA connection. And among them was a document describing a CIA official taking out $8 million in bearer bonds to San Francisco to tide them over. And we don't know for sure, but most likely Ben was the bagman.
Mm-hmm. Jan, of course, has seen the book, and what's her overall reaction to the portrait that you painted of her husband?
She's very complimentary about the book. She's very happy about the book. I mean, I have to say, among all of the people that I interviewed, I never found anyone to say anything negative about Ben Evans' character or the way he was in the world. The only negative thing that I heard was from a pretty hardcore CIA guy who knew the family. And when I was asking him about the story of Ben throwing up because he was asked to assassinate somebody he knew or to arrange the assassination, he just said, yeah, I didn't think he was tough enough. He needed to be an administrator. He wasn't, that wasn't who he was. And Ben Evans got into the CIA because he had seen the aftermath of war in occupied Japan. He'd seen the horrors of war. And he believed that the CIA could fend off the great catastrophe of war through these other means, through learning about their adversaries, through developing enough intelligence so they could respond without having to resort to war. Now, that's kind of the great dream of the intelligence officers. I've heard that more than once. Is that the way it worked out? Well, the CIA became the CIA. The CIA was the CIA and is the CIA. But nonetheless, that was his idealistic hope for his career in the CIA.
Can you talk about Jan and Ben's children and eventually how did he pass away? How did he die? What happened to Ben?
They had two daughters, Carla and Louise, and from the time, there we are. So actually, the man on the right is General Eugene Harrison, and that's his wife, who was the widow of Major King, with Ben Evans on the left. And those are the two daughters. It would be Carla on the left and Louise on the right. And they're in Florida. After the general retired, they had a place in Clearwater, Florida, that was where they would go yearly for a couple of weeks. And Ben typically couldn't fly down there because that was the era of the hijackings to Cuba. And so the CIA required that he take a train down. His wife and the daughters could fly down, but he would have to take a train down. I don't know if that changed at some point. But the daughters, they grew up in Washington. So after his posting to Cuba, he was essentially based in Washington. They lived in a family mansion. There were many family mansions in Washington. That when I was visiting with Jan, she would drive me around Washington in her old Cadillac and would point out, like, oh yeah, so that was my grandfather's mansion, which is still there by DuPont Circle, called the Brewmaster's Mansion, which is now a historic home. And well, that was my grandfather's mansion, or my grandmother's mansion over there. And then, well, that was my uncle's. And then, well, this is mine that I bought from my mother. And, so they lived in Northwest Washington among the embassies. And they lived a pretty cultured life, a pretty privileged life. And at some point, Jan started buying up hunt country land out in Virginia. And they own 1,200 acres now of Virginia hunt country land. And I learned, you get to go down a lot of rabbit holes in a project like this. And among them is, I now know a lot more about fox hunting than I did. I now understand that the hounds are the stars. I didn't know that before. The riders are just the spectators, very vigorously engaged spectators, but it's the dogs. I didn't know that. So the Virginia, one of the major Virginia fox hunting things would start at the Evans farm. That was where it would start each year. It was kind of a big social event for them.
So you learn something new all the time when you're doing a book project, I know.
Yeah.
Now, did Ben died fairly young? How old was he when he died, and what happened?
He was still in his 50s, and he developed pancreatic cancer and died about 6 years after he retired. Now, he might
have a lot of chance to enjoy his retirement, yeah.
He didn't, but he got to live out at the farm. He loved the farm. I'm going back to his childhood with his grandfather out in their country estate outside of Crawfordsville. That was where he was always really happy. And he, everybody that I talked to would say, "Oh, Ben's so happy," and they would go out there on the weekends. And then when he was able to retire out there from the Washington, he never was really involved with the social world. His wife loved the Washington social life. And he went to a lot of parties, and it was certainly somebody that you wanted to sit next to because he always wanted to talk about you. He was very deft at not talking about himself. For instance, the woman who ran the Virginia fox hunting thing, became a friend of his because they would go out and keep the trails clear. That was kind of part of the process. You had to keep the trails clear for the horses and for the hounds to do the fox hunting. And he was always involved with that. He loved to work on the farm. And they had a friendship for sure. And she said, I never knew he was in the CIA. I always thought maybe he was with the Army. Mm-hmm. And I asked her, I said, well, did he ever talk about his life as an equestrian and being the captain of the Black Horse Troop at Culver? No, he never said anything about that. So
Yeah. Now, in your writings from Afghanistan and for this project, did you ever come up against any national security issues that concerned you when you're writing these kinds of books?
I was always, particularly with the Afghanistan war book, because it was current, and my take on it was a total failure and was doomed. The counterinsurgency in particular, our failed and wildly dysfunctional counterinsurgency. That was very controversial, and as my friends in the military would kind of tell me off to the side, like, well, this hasn't made you any friends in the Pentagon or in the CIA. This is controversial stuff, because at the time I was writing that, no one was really writing about what a failure was, what it looked like on the ground. There was a story that was told from podiums in Washington that bore no resemblance to the on-the-ground reality and the ground truth in Afghanistan. And so I had to be very careful. And I would have whistleblowers after I began writing about this. Whistleblowers would come to me, and I would say, don't send me any classified documents. Don't show me any classified documents. Everything I dealt with was on the record or was told to me on deep background sometimes. The documents that I dealt with were all open source documents, just to avoid that, to avoid what could have happened to me.
Right.
And the documents that I was dealing with the CIA documents, these are all declassified documents.
In looking at his career, do you think Benjamin Evans had any regrets about what he did for a career?
I think he was a true believer. I think he believed in the value of the intelligence services. He was a very conservative man, and his values were in tune with the way the CIA thought about things. He had certainly a tropism toward order and a tropism toward maintaining the established social order. And I believe he really thought that he could help prevent catastrophic war.
What about Ben's brother, Dan? What kind of a career did he have?
Dan became a pretty powerful guy in Indiana. He was an attorney. I'm getting there are many Dans in
That's right.
Which can be, when you're first starting out, can be incredibly confusing when you're realizing, like, oh, they're talking about a Dan Evans from 2 generations before, and he ran the LS Ayres company for many years. Was a war hero, was out in the Pacific.
I'm going to go back to your writing process. Is there a particular, like, a time you like to write, a place where you like to do your writing? Just how do you approach it when you're ready to sit down and actually put words on paper, or these days words on a computer screen?
Yeah, there's just a lot that goes into organizing the material for a book of this nature, as you know.
Yeah.
There's a lot of internet research for nowadays, where so much stuff is on the internet, so many documents. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of generating documents, digging out stuff, ferreting out books. That I'm lucky that I live in Bloomington, which has the Indiana University Libraries, which is one of the largest collection of books in the world. And they have really obscure stuff. So, you know, I'm 10 minutes away from that, and I can go over and start working my way through a lot of books that would be difficult to come up with, that aren't even online, you know, that haven't been digitized. 3x5 cards, you know, pads and pads of yellow page notes. And at some point, when you've got to assemble all that stuff, I would take it all, and I would take my laptop over to the Monroe County Public Library, because there was nothing to distract me. And there's one room that's got big sunny windows, and it's got big maple tables, and I could lay everything out, and I could piece together each chapter when it came to that moment where I thought I had as much as I could get. And that was where I would write the first drafts. Once your first draft, that big, ugly, really nasty first draft is done, then, you know, then it's another process. But getting all that put together is always a tussle. And, you know, and of course, you can imagine that the place where I would go in the Monroe County Public Library was the Indiana room.
Very appropriate.
Yeah.
Now, do you expect to hear, or have you heard from any CIA agents or associated with the agency with a reaction to your book yet? Do you think you'll hear from them?
I've heard from one, maybe two. And you have to understand, I mean, I learned as I would interview often long retired CIA officers that they were it was very predictable that they would lie, sometimes lie really big. And you know, and I would just try and keep a straight face, because I would, you know, maybe I would have already seen the declassified documents and know they were dissembling, know they were fabricating. It was just kind of like almost a reflex, you know. So they either stay pretty quiet, like Ben Evans, or they're going to lie to you.
Right.
And not always. Some were more candid than others, but I always knew, boy, you better be able to check out whatever it's, you know. In some cases, you'll find in the footnotes in Gentlemen in the Shadows, in the footnote, you'll see, like, here's what this person said, and here's these documents, and that's what they said, and it's your call.
Yeah. Do you have a next project in mind? Or are you kind of in between? Where are you at?
Well, I'm working on a piece about the abstract expressionist sculptor David Smith, that was a really important figure in American art history. And Smith taught at Indiana University in the 50s. And when he was here, he was only here for a year or so, he did a really paradigm shifting series of sculptures called the Forgings. And it had a big impact on art history. And when he did it with the help of a local blacksmith. And I was always intrigued by that, and he and the blacksmith became friends. And at the time that Smith was doing that, he was already celebrated as the best sculptor working in America. So in my mind, it's this kind of guy that is off in the ether of the American art world, yet he forms this deep bond with this local blacksmith. And I wanted to kind of unveil those things, their friendship, the collaboration, how it worked, and understand more about the local blacksmith, what I've been able to do. I've managed to find some really amazing primary source material, and that's really been a fun process. I'm looking forward to continuing to work on that. I've been out to Smith's really famous place where he lived for many years was a farm beside Lake George. I've been out to that area. I've met some of the family, and they're very excited about this aspect. It's a kind of really completely unknown aspect of David Smith's career. There's many books about David Smith, but this is this one aspect of his work.
Sounds intriguing. Time's running short here, so I just want to again put in a plug for Doug's book from the IHS Press, Gentlemen in the Shadows, about Benjamin Evans' career, which is available through our Bazille History Market. Go to shopindianahistory.org, and also you can catch up with some of Doug's work at his website, douglaswissing.com. And I want to thank Doug for taking time this evening to talk to us about this intriguing Hoosier character and a notable person. And I'll turn it back to Bethany for some last words about maybe what's coming up next for the Hoosier Happy Hour.
Of course. Thank you so much, Ray. And thank you so much, Doug. I cannot wait to dive into my copy. I dropped the link for the store in the chat. You'll see that link again tomorrow in your follow-up email. I highly recommend it. This was phenomenal. So thank you both so much for spending your evening with us and talking about this. I hope that you as participants, and Doug, you're welcome to join us too for more happy hours. Next week, we'll look into the glazed history of donuts, and further afield, we'll have topics on Asian activism, the Equal Rights Amendment, underwear, and more. You can sign up for those programs and all of the rest of them at indianahistory.org. That link is in the chat for you. And if you're looking for something a little different, I highly recommend our Family History Workshop on July 25th, where we take a multi-sensory approach to research through In4D. Even further afield into August, I hope you join us for the style, flair, and care of Black hair, women behaving badly, and even more. If you missed your chance to donate or would like to make a further gift to support the Indiana Historical Society, you will see that link in the chat, as well in the email tomorrow. In that email tomorrow, you'll see these links as well as a survey. It takes less than a minute to do. I'd love to know what you thought about the program and how we can make programs at IHS better. So I hope you take that less than a minute to fill that out. This conversation will be posted to the IHS YouTube channel and our website in the coming weeks. And until we see you again, I hope you stay safe, healthy, and sane. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.